Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Being Muslim, where I'll be hosting the program. My name is Oli Noor. Now, as we know, especially during these trying times, during the lockdowns that we've had and during the pandemic that we are all witnessing and experiencing, the question of health comes up once again and again. And sometimes our health, we think about it and we reflect and ponder upon whether we may ponder upon our mortality, our fate, and reflect on our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So to speak about this relationship between health and spirituality, I've brought a guest from the north of England over a video call, Imam Raza. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you so much for having me on your show today. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you.
I want to say Jazakallah khairan for accepting the invitation. And you are an imam and a hospital chaplain. And I wanted to ask if you can give a little bit more background about yourself so that our viewers understand where you are coming from.
Yeah, so I trained at several madrasas in the UK, studying the Quran, Hadith, Fiqh, etc., memorized the Quran for over 12 years. When I finished my madrasa training, I then entered into imamat, so leading prayers at the local masjid for several years. During that time, I became heavily invested in community matters besides matters within the masjid. And therefore, I then became involved in interfaith work, in local voluntary work around university chaplaincy and acute hospitals as well. And also, I then basically developed several organizations and became part of several organizations which were underpinned by helping people within the community, both Muslim and non-Muslim, in various ways through welfare, education, and social engagement. So then what then happened was, during my time as an imam, I thought, you know what, maybe I could do a bit more than just being an imam in a masjid. Maybe my potential to do more is evidently there. And hence, therefore, I applied to become a mental health chaplain. And lo and behold, Allah blessed me with the opportunity to become a mental health chaplain, non-voluntary, must I say. And hence, as a result of that, here I am now, and I've been a mental health chaplain for 3.5 to 4 years now.
Okay, mashallah. It sounds like you've been through, you're quite experienced within community work, and you mentioned this thing about working interfaith and as well as in the social and education field. And I've introduced you as a chaplain, and you mentioned this word chaplaincy a couple of times. And from my understanding, the word chaplain, it sounds like a very Christian concept. I was wondering if you can elaborate on what chaplain is exactly, and more so what a hospital chaplain is.
I think before the formation of hospitals, or even the NHS, where there were sick people within communities, for example, within England, you'd always have a doctor, and you'd have a minister, or a Christian minister, or church minister, who would come out into the community side by side with doctors and administer spiritual support and prayers for those suffering within the community. This was way before hospitals were developed in the way we know nowadays. Hence, as a result of that, chaplaincy, chaplaincy, to be precise in terms of what it meant through Christian community ministry, was to walk alongside the path of those who are suffering. It wasn't to tell them what to do. It wasn't to administer any medication of any sort, but it was to walk alongside those who were suffering from illnesses, so that they would know that they were not in their path to recovery alone, but they had someone there with them. So this is where chaplaincy stems from. Somewhat that chaplaincy, in terms of its origins, is more spiritual sort of service rather than a Christian-based service. However, whether Christian or not in terms of its origin, point is that the idea of holistically caring for another while side by side in their journey to recovery is essentially what chaplaincy is all about.
So this is where the doctor is treating the patient physically. It is to ensure that their spiritual and even psychological care is being looked after. And so from my understanding, it's a very holistic type of care rather than just administering medicine, take this and that. It's a very well-rounded sort of a role, you could say.
If you look at psychotherapy and every type of therapy that there is, before the development of these therapies in a more formidable format that we have nowadays within hospitals, the chaplain or the minister or the community minister was himself a beacon of not just pastoral support, but also support from a psycho sort of social perspective, so that the chaplain was someone who would administer, but also engage with the patient in all forms of societal healing, whether it was pastoral, family related, or even in terms of behavioral management, etc. So that's where it stemmed from as well.
Okay, so where do you as a Muslim fit with this role as a hospital chaplain?
Well, as chaplaincy has grown over time throughout the centuries, and as the UK became much more multicultural due to migrants that came into the UK from various parts of the world, I think in the 50s or the 60s, due to the increased migration factor within the UK, there also was a debate, but also a discussion in how to facilitate the spiritual and the religious needs of migrants coming into the UK when it came to administering health-related care. So as a result of that, chaplaincy in terms of a multicultural dimension began arguably from the 50s or 60s, and the development of chaplaincy from a Muslim perspective began from a voluntary role. In other words, local imams would literally be invited to come to hospitals, for example, or even prisons, and just to pray for patients, or to basically administer last rites in terms of death rites, or basically to advise on prayer times, etc. That was in the 80s or the 70s or the 80s.
Okay.
However, now Muslim chaplaincy, or chaplaincy from a Muslim perspective, has now become a vocation, both part-time, full-time, voluntary, sessional work as well. So it's now much more constructive in terms of pay, in terms of career progression, in terms of duties, etc. Whereas before, during the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, Muslims or imams did not have the opportunity to do that. It was pretty much a guest, it was pretty much like inviting a guest to come to the hospital or the prison just for once in a while or something, just to advise on several matters, and that's it. However, now chaplains, in terms of Muslims, chaplains are pretty much bread and butter of the organizations that they serve.
And so it sounds like for Muslims, from the Muslim community, it has progressed from a role where it was the imam's duty, and there's an endless list of duties that imams have, and this would have been one of the additional duties, to something that has now been separated into another role completely. And I wanted to ask on this idea of imams serving this position, but because this is not necessarily just imams in the hospital field, in the hospital as a chaplains, is it just males that serve this role?
No, I think in one of my around the future of Muslim chaplaincy last year, I explored the literature around what is the future of chaplaincy. Is chaplaincy similar to imamate? Is it different? Because if we were to argue that chaplaincy was similar to imamate, then there is no scope for female alimas, graduates, or even female Muslim in general, to have any participation when it comes to chaplaincy. So therefore, in my view, chaplaincy is a service which serves the community from a spiritual angle, which befits both female and male spiritual leadership, besides imamate, which we can definitely confirm that is a male-dominated role. So I would say chaplaincy is not this similar to imamate, though some of the trends of imamate are found within the role of chaplaincy, but chaplaincy is much more than that. It's an organizational vocation which serves both the hospital and beyond. So I believe that women, Muslim women, are equal to their male counterparts when it comes to chaplaincy in the servitude of people.
Okay, Jazakallah khair for that clarification. Earlier, you touched on the history of chaplaincy and how it went from a Christian-based role to something that, because of the influx of migration, to something that is much more broader. And I wanted to ask, why do hospitals provide this service, and is it just hospitals? I believe you did touch upon this earlier a little bit.
Hospitals provide the service, prisons provide the service. You have educational establishments like the universities. You also have the Navy, the Army. You have airport chaplaincy. You have chaplaincy in various degrees. So chaplaincy now, especially in accordance with NHS guidelines, stems from a spiritual perspective. What that means is, if you look at chaplaincy teams nowadays in the UK, for example, you have now humanists who are now chaplains or chaplaincy team leaders. You have certain teams which are not depicted as chaplaincy teams anymore, but they're called spiritual and well-being teams. And that in itself indicates the future of chaplaincy in the UK through the NHS, in terms of from being a Christian origin type of service, but more a broader service. I would also want to add to that something else. That doesn't mean that in every hospital or in every prison or in everywhere that you see now, that everything is now multicultural. There are many chaplaincy teams which do hold a Christian-centric foundation in terms of its organizational values, and other chaplains from other backgrounds are add-ons to that particular service.
Okay. So within the Jazakallah khairan for this explanation about what chaplaincy is, and I think we've maybe spoken about this word a bit too much already. But in terms of the availability of Muslim spiritual counsel or Muslim chaplains, what is the availability within NHS trusts or healthcare facilities, and how would one get in touch, or how would one call upon the local Muslim chaplain or Muslim spiritual advisor?
Well, there are several ways. So, for example, each hospital has a switchboard. So you'll call the switchboard and you'll ask, can I speak to the imam or the Muslim chaplain? And they would immediately direct you towards the Muslim chaplain. Similarly,
sorry to interrupt, but when you say switchboard, for our viewers who don't understand what that means, can you explain that?
Okay. So basically, each hospital has a main number that you can call. That main number leads you to the central hub of the hospital, which is the information desk. That is where what we deem as the switchboard resides. In other words, that number, if you call any hospital main number, it'll give you several options in terms of who you wish to speak to. So, for example, in the hospital that I serve, our main hospital number, once you call it, the person at the desk will say to you, switchboard, who would you like to speak to? And then if you say, I'd like to speak to chaplaincy, then the call is then directed to chaplaincy department. If you want to speak to a specific chaplain, then they will direct you immediately to the specific chaplain.
Okay, Jazakallah khair for that. And just one final question before we head into a break. What spiritual impact or what sort of faith counseling does a chaplain provide?
So each chaplain comes from a different background. Okay. Each chaplain has specialities attached to their vocation. Some are counselors, some are psychotherapists, etc. So all in all, chaplains provide pastoral care, whether it's religious or spiritual.
So let's say, because we are Muslims, we want to get in touch with the Muslim chaplain or the imam. What sort of why would patients reach out to an imam or a Muslim chaplain?
Sometimes patients, both Muslims and non-Muslims, want to explore a deeper meaning behind their illnesses. Sometimes they don't get answers through medicinal sort of intake. Sometimes they want to speak to someone to find out what is the meaning of life, what is the meaning of health and illness. So I've had in my experience both Muslims and non-Muslims call upon me just to have a chat about the meaning of life. Even Muslims as well. There are many Muslims I've come across in hospitals who may not pray, etc., but they are searching for the meaning of life, the meaning of why they are alive, why are they ill, etc. So chaplains provide a space, a confidential space, wherein patients are able to speak to them on a one-to-one basis without being judged, no biasness attached to any conversation, and are able to basically be listened to.
Okay. What about if do you see any patients that maybe just simply have questions around fiqh, for example, or they just simply have a mas'ala, Islamic question that they just need to ask, and they're not looking for spiritual counsel? Do you also attend to those sort of calls?
Absolutely. We chaplains provide ethical care and ethical reasoning around patients' care. So sometimes patients do call up and say, hey, this medicine that I'm being given, is it halal or haram? Is it permissible or not permissible? What does Islam say around this? Is the COVID vaccine, is it allowed for me or not? Sometimes I've had patients, Muslim patients, saying to me, oh, there's a female doctor who comes and sees me. I don't want to see the female doctor because according to Islam, we're not supposed to have gender interaction. So these are some of the things that have come about in terms of my experience of engaging with Muslim patients.
Okay, Jazakallah khairan. We're going to go to break shortly, but just to let our viewers know, after the break, we'll be speaking about Imam Raza's experience in the hospital a little bit more, and a few more things surrounding Muslim issues when it comes to the hospital. So I'll see everyone after the break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Being Muslim, hosted by me, Oli Noor. Just before the break, we had Imam Raza on speaking about the institution of chaplaincy within healthcare, and a little bit informing us a little bit about what it provides. And before the break, we spoke a little bit about how the types of patients that chaplains go to see. So just to welcome back to the show, Imam Raza, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Okay, So before the break, we spoke a little bit about going to see the patients and when you see them for their spiritual needs. And I wanted to explore this idea of when whether it's yourself or other Muslim chaplains, when they get called out to see Muslim patients, what sort of issues may arise. Before the break, you brought up the idea of gender interaction. If you can expand on this within the healthcare.
Yeah. Just to give you a few examples, I've come across patients who have refused to be in the same room as other female doctors and therapists. I've had resistance from certain Muslim patients, male Muslim patients, towards medicine or being given something or being told what to do, because whilst they were at home before coming into hospital, they've never been told what to do, you know? So issues around authority, listening to people, issues around identity, issues around interpretation and understanding what the doctor is trying to say. These are some of the major issues that I've come to see and know of. And sometimes as a chaplain, you need to ensure that you have the art of negotiation embedded within your way of working in order to streamline the care package for the patients, whereby the patient doesn't feel left alone, but if he's included in that journey, and that the doctors are able to do their job as well. So sometimes it takes a bit of negotiation with Muslim patients to ensure that they know that they are not alone and that they're not basically treated any differently from anybody else. Sometimes that's exacerbated by the way the world is, in terms of, in many places, the way Muslims are minoritized and targeted because of their faith. Sometimes that element becomes part of the psyche within certain Muslim patients that I've come across. So to them, everyone is an enemy. Everyone is out there to get them, you know? And sometimes I do explain to doctors, etc., that look, these issues that several Muslim patients may have is because of these issues. So sometimes doctors, in knowing what, the social issues which can have an impact on the psyche of certain Muslim patients, they become much more lenient. They become much more engaging and understanding as well.
Okay. And before the break, you mentioned some concerns that patients may have surrounding even medicine. And for example, if it were Ramadan, where a person's meant to be fasting, and there's certain dispensations for patients in general that are available. I wanted your advice for our audience. If they happen to be in hospitals due to need or necessity, whether they are allowed to listen to the experts, and if they must consult the imam.
If you look at worldwide medical Muslim ethics, and in terms of several bodies such as Iman in the US, and you have Sharia councils in Saudi Arabia, etc. One thing you would find in relation to the literature around medical ethics in relation to Muslim patients is that whatever advice doctors give in relation to the rehabilitation of Muslim patients in terms of their health, even whether it's Ramadan or not, that guidance should be always taken as something serious. Okay, so health supersedes everything else. So if it's Ramadan and a Muslim patient wants to fast, but they know they can't fast because of their illness or weakness, and they try to fast, then that can be detrimental according to the health if doctors advise that their health will deteriorate as a result of that. So my advice to Muslim patients is this, that let's just say it's Ramadan and you feel guilty in relation to not fasting because of your illness. Always remember that even those who are chronically ill and cannot fast, if they give charity or say a word of charity or say a word of kindness, then even you may not be fasting, you will still hold the same virtues and rewards as though you were fasting, like those who are fasting around you. So Allah says in the Quran, "La yukallifu Allahu nafsan illa wus'aha," that Allah does not burden a soul much more that it can bear. So always know that you are there in hospital due to the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because your sins are being forgiven. Your position is being elevated. So at that same time, whatever concessions there are in the Sharia, which is very evident within the Quran and in other places as well, take upon those streams of guidance that Allah has enabled within Islamic literature and scripture, and use that as a means of underpinning your attitude towards doctors around you. And in doing so, your road to recovery will be much more pleasant rather than in a sense of isolation.
And for those family members, especially during these times where visitations to hospital is extremely limited, what can family members do or say for their family who are in hospital, whether hospital or at home, but due to illness they are somewhat incapacitated, or maybe even something very minor? Do you have any advice that not just on Imam, but just what anyone can say or do?
Yeah. One thing I have found out during this period of COVID, in relation, I can talk about all patients, but I'll specify Muslim patients for now.
Okay.
When Muslim patients have not been able to leave hospital or get visitors, for example, or even in the community where they can't leave their home, I have found, in my experience, that dua, or patients knowing that people in the community are praying for them, though they cannot meet them, that does the world of difference to patients, because they're not isolated anymore, but that they know that they are being mentioned in the du'as and the prayers of other people. So community support can happen in many ways, and I think what I would say is, if you have a loved one that you can't visit, always know that through telephone or whatever means necessary, always make sure that they are not alone. In other words, besides just saying that you love them and you're with them, always know that the community are there too in their path to recovery, so they don't feel alone. People want to be remembered after they die. People want to be remembered when they're ill. When people are ill, they feel that the whole world is different, And during those times, loneliness settles in, and at that time, in my experience, I have found that people just want to be remembered. They want to know that they're loved. So communication, whether visiting or not, is so important.
Okay. Jazakallah khairan for that. And as we know, the hospitals are not just for when people fall ill, but people go there because many births take place, and sadly, many people may end up in the hospital and pass away. And previously, we have had a guest who spoke about the practical elements about what to do in the case of death, the certain steps and procedures of what to do in the case of death within the family. But we haven't had an Imam speak about the faith aspect or the Islamic aspect surrounding not just deaths but also births. So if you can speak. Okay.
Yeah, so what I'll do, I'll talk about death first.
Okay.
So normally what happens when a patient passes away, a Muslim patient, I get a call, I then go to the room where the patient's passed away. At that time, doctors are very careful not to touch the patient. They always ask me, Imam, what do you think we should do? Can we go in? Should we stay outside? And sometimes the family is there and the family are sensitive as well. So normally at that time, what I do is I lead the doctors, etc., on matters in relation to emotional and religious coping mechanisms, on what works and what may not work in relation to the family around the deceased. Okay? So that's the first thing that I do. So I always advise them, look, let me speak to the family and ask them what they want. Do they want their loved one to be washed whilst in the bed? Do they want the wires to be removed? What would they like to happen? And based on the advice of the family, the doctors then go in, they sort of wash the deceased, and they basically close the mouth, they put the hands and the feet together, etc. Once they've done that, based on the guidance and the advice of the family as well as myself, then the doctors they leave. The Muslim undertaker, he's called in, he gets a death certificate, and then they move the body from the hospital, okay, into a mortuary for ritual washing and burial. Now, that's very organizational, what I've just said there. However, the emotional element in all of that is very, very important to address when it comes to those particular sensitive moments. So what I've realized is that dua, Quran, and just being there and with words of comfort and support is something which is so important for families in those times. They remember you for the rest of your life, for the rest of their lives, for that, you know. And sometimes what I found is by me talking in a particular way, doctors have followed suit, and that has enabled a holistic way of looking from a family perspective at the whole hospital in terms of the emotional care that they are providing, so that they can provide religious mechanisms and coping mechanisms in the best way possible for the sake of the family. So that's death, okay? When it comes to birth, again, I get called upon in the hospital where there is a birth in order to do the adhan, or in order to advise on complications which can happen post-birth, you know. So intense bleeding, for example, or sometimes I've come across Muslim women who, after giving birth, they have fainted, some are in a coma, family members don't know what to do. Because let's be honest, they're not just worried about their spouses, they're worried about their children as well. You know, the newborn child, what's going to happen to the newborn child? What if my wife passes away? Who's going to look after the child? So, as a Muslim chaplain, going into the hospital, what I do normally is I sort of ensure that there is regular support, emotional support for the father, for the family, and of course for the mother. Okay. At that same time, I ensure that not only is their stay there a means of them getting support from a medicinal and from a healthcare point of view, but from a social point of view, from an emotional point of view, I also tap into services in the community in order to help the couple and their baby. So, for example, once they transition from hospital into the community, there is a streamline of healthcare support in terms of a package, which is always there once they return back home. So really, in both cases, what you may have realized from what I'm saying is that the social element is as important as any other element when it comes to death, dying, or even birth in itself.
And this idea of providing that social element and that emotional support reminds me of when we read that certain companions, radiallahu anhum, for whatever reason, when they were interacting with the Prophet ﷺ, and they would come away and they would describe that the way that the Prophet ﷺ would address them, they felt that they were the most important person in the world to Rasulullah ﷺ. And so I can see how important it is to engage in a very social and emotional manner, not just and really add that foundation to the spiritual support that you provide. And I want to move on to the next question. Earlier you mentioned that you also see non-Muslim patients. I was a little bit curious about this, and I wanted to ask a little bit about why is it that they may seek someone of another faith, and what lessons can we as Muslims take from your engagement with non-Muslim patients?
Yeah, I would say to anyone aspiring to be a chaplain as a Muslim that nowadays a lot of the roles advertised in a lot of hospitals are for generic chaplaincy roles. So not specific Muslim roles, but generic chaplaincy roles in order to befit the criteria of a full-time post. You will hardly find a Muslim chaplain in a full-time post as opposed to a Muslim imam or a female being in a generic full-time post. So that's I'd like to mention that first and foremost. Secondly, working as I do as a generic chaplain in my post now, from a Muslim background, I'm able to transcend between different types of patients, both Muslims and non-Muslims, through the same realm of chaplaincy support. So as a result of that, every day and every time when I'm seeing patients, especially non-Muslim patients, I'm contextualizing my deen, my faith, my religion for the benefit of non-Muslim patients so that they can receive pastoral care and support, but also they understand that Islam in itself, because as a Muslim, as a chaplain, they know that that Muslim chaplaincy in itself, the foundation of Muslim chaplaincy is underpinned by the verse of the Quran which depicts the Prophet ﷺ as a mercy unto worlds. So وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. The late Dr. Atullah Siddiqui rahimahullah ta'ala always used to say to me in my discussions with him that Rahmatul lil Alameen, mercy unto all worlds, should be the foundation of the concept of Muslim chaplaincy, whether both for Muslims or non-Muslims, within a hospital or a prison or even an educational role. So my underpinning of working with non-Muslims is through that my da'wah, my introduction to Islam for their sake is through my character, is through my personality, it's through my behavior. So when non-Muslim patients want to see me, they don't want to see me only because I'm a Muslim. They want to see me because they like my character. They like my behavior. They like the fact that I actively listen. I am emotionally engaging, etc. And these are the type of qualities that all chaplains should have, both Muslim and non-Muslim. And in doing so, whatever faith origin one may be from or non-faith origin, in terms of patients, they will always look at you because of the attention that you give to them in terms of your healthcare sort of package that you deliver.
So, mashallah, it sounds like this idea of being merciful and kind, it's the concept that I can see that is very central to your role as a chaplain within the healthcare, but also something that we can, as regular human beings, something that we can go away and implement in ourselves. And it also reminds me of the ayah, فَبِمَا رَحْمَةٍ مِّنَ اللَّهِ لِنْتَ لَهُمْ وَلَوْ كُنْتَ فَضًّا غَلِيظَ الْقَلْبِ لَانفَضُّوا مِنْ حَوْلِكَ, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses the Prophet ﷺ that it is by the mercy of Allah that you are soft with them. And had you been harsh and hard-hearted, then they would have dispersed from you. And so, mashallah, it's really inspiring to hear your approach in your work with non-Muslims and allowing your character to be the ambassador to Islam within your work. I wanted to ask another question. We've spoken. I've mentioned COVID a few times recently, and especially during these particularly hard times, we are hearing of many people within our communities, whether it's down south of England in London, for example, where I am, or north of England, where you are. Many members of the community are, in the hospital due to COVID, or they're falling ill. I wanted to ask if you had any particular advice surrounding this issue.
Well, first and foremost, what I would say is COVID,
yes,
in terms of its many strains, is a real thing. And I've seen people in front of me die because of it, both Muslim and non-Muslim. We just had a staff member, 39 years old, who died from COVID 2 weeks ago. Had no underlying conditions, whatnot. So what I would say is COVID, like any other illness, is real.
Yes.
Okay. Now, in terms of governmental guidance, in terms of wearing masks, socially distanced, etc., these are all forms of guidance which are there to ensure that we don't catch COVID, or if we do have COVID, we don't give COVID to anybody else. Now, like flu, like any other type of illness, it's upon us as individuals to ensure that we remain healthy as much as possible, not taking any risks whatsoever. So it is something, and I must say that the COVID pandemic has taught me that there is a lot of fragility when it comes to community togetherness, congregation, and cohesion. I'm not just talking about Muslims here, I'm talking about people who aren't Muslims. There's a lot of skepticism. There's a lot of backlash. There's a lot of finger pointing which goes on to blame others for the reason of a particular illness. We don't see the same thing when it comes for the flu or for pneumonia or for anything like that, but we see it for COVID. So what I would say is this: I know it's very hard because I know it's very hard for Muslims to not have the congregational value that they are normally sort of accustomed to within their day-to-day lives because of COVID. I understand that. Not going to the masjid, for example, as an example, okay? Or not being able to see your family, or not being able to do Eid together. I understand how hard that is. However, on the flip side, it should cause us to ponder, what is the meaning of life? What is the true meaning of family? If we've always wanted to have congregation outside of our homes, isn't it about time that we develop congregational values within the home? And if we have disputes at home and we have broken homes, then what can we do more to mend our family ties? You know? So for me, though it's a negative scenario, I think we need to look at the positives. What forms of positivity can we develop from these situations? And last but not least, in relation to the vaccination, which, like everybody else, there are people who are skeptics, there are people who will take it, there are people who will not take it. Many fatwas and many rulings have been passed by many organizations to say that taking the COVID vaccine, whether it's Moderna, whether it's AstraZeneca, Oxford vaccine, whether it's Pfizer, etc., all are permitted for the sake of regaining one's health. Now, skeptics, may I say, aren't necessarily from a Muslim orientation. You have skeptics who are non-Muslim as well. You have YouTube channels and many other accounts on social media which are there developed by even non-Muslims who are skeptic and think that basically there are particular things within vaccines which are there to control us and to make our lives miserable, etc. Now, what I would say is this: we have to ensure one thing, that in Islam, run, as Allah says in the Quran, don't draw yourself to unwarranted thoughts, because that can negatively impact your way of looking at the world. Okay? If you don't wish to take something, fine, that's your choice, but don't prevent others from taking the very same thing.
Imam Raza, Jazakallahu khairan for showing us that, or at least from your experience, giving us insight into how real the COVID is. And we actually had a show about a month ago about the vaccine itself, addressing some of these concerns. And I want to say Jazakallahu khairan for accepting my invitation to come on the show and speak a little bit about spiritual care within the healthcare institutions. And inshallah, we'll end the show here, and please tune in next week on Being Muslim, where we will have another guest to speak about their field. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.